All right, so we did this Feedlot on Fields project, is what we called it, at Fort Ellis, and it was a really interesting project. So one of the main detriments to actually having livestock in a feedlot setting is all that manure and urine that accumulates, and you get a lot of pathogens, and whoever's running the feedlot is actually having to pay someone to get rid of that manure and urine. So we were thinking, if we can actually feed lambs out on wheat stubble fields and have them apply that manure and urine directly to the field, we're cutting out a lot of cost and potentially having healthier, happier lambs. And so what we did for this project at Fort Ellis, we had a 5-year crop rotation, and of the 5 years, year 3 and 5 were both in winter wheat. So after harvesting the winter wheat, we went through and cut those fields in half and put recently weaned lambs on either half. And so the plot was a 1/3 acre. We cut it down to a 1/6 of an acre and put about 6 lambs on each side. And they were either fed an alfalfa pellet or a barley pellet. And the barley pellet is kind of mimicking that a common feedlot diet. You're going to feed them with some type of grain. The alfalfa diet is mimicking more of a forage-based finishing diet, which is getting more popular in recent years. And so we actually had sheep in confinement as well. So if you look at your picture, I just threw out a picture of each. We have lambs in a confinement setting, eating either the alfalfa or barley pellet, and then lambs out on these wheat stubble plots. And so the lambs that were out on the plots, we weren't expecting them to graze the wheat stubble. We were actually supplementing them with their their feed. And so I actually took those hog feeders and I put skids on them, and I took stall mats and put those on top, and they were portable feeders. And so we have a little 4-wheeler or a John Deere Gator, and I would fill those feeders with pellets every single day, whatever their alfalfa or barley based diet was. And then I could actually pull them around the field to help distribute that manure and urine. Since they like to congregate around those feeders, that was just better for the fields to help spread it out across the wheat stubble. And so what we found from doing this, we had the sheep in confinement that were actually on grow-safe feeders, and the grow-safe feeders measure individual animal intake. And so every lamb in the grow-safe has a little ear tag with a microchip in it that reads their number as they put their head in the feeder. So they put their head in the feeder, their whatever diet, the alfalfa or barley, is on a scale, and as they consume, it measures how much they're eating every second. So we could actually track their intake. Out in the field, we didn't have that luxury, so we actually just measured based on disappearance. If I put 10 pounds out there and they consumed 10, I'd split it between 10 sheep. They each consumed 1 pound. And so we didn't have as precise measurements out in the field, but we could still tell how much each treatment was consuming of either the barley or alfalfa diet. And what we found after this 3 years is that the sheep that were out on these wheat stubble plots actually performed better than the sheep that were in confinement. And it did actually surprise me a little bit, because the sheep that are in confinement, they kind of sat around all day and they didn't run around and play. They didn't have to deal with all the weather. During this study, we had sheep out on these plots when it was negative 20 degrees, and trying to haul water out to them was very difficult. I would fill a water tank on the back of the truck, put a hose for the hot water inside of the barn into the water tank. By the time I got out to the field and tried to get it into their water trough, it was frozen. And so the sheep out in these plots actually did perform better. They had higher average daily gain and higher ending body weights than the lambs that were in confinement. When we look at, so we compared the alfalfa diet versus the barley diet, and lambs that consumed the alfalfa diet, so that forage-based diet, were less tender than lambs that consumed the barley diet. And that's not new research. That has been proven that forage-based is usually not quite as tender. But our numbers, if we had done a taste panel, those tenderness differences would not have been noticeable to a consumer. And so science, statistically, it was significant. There was a difference, but a consumer would not have noticed a difference in tenderness for the alfalfa or barley. The other half of this study, we wanted to see how the lambs would perform in confinement versus finished out in the field, and then the alfalfa versus the barley. But the other half of this project, we wanted to see what benefit this would have to a farmer. So we have a lot of wheat stubble fields in Montana, and we have a lot of sheep. And a lot of sheep go into a feedlot setting as lambs. But if we can actually just put those sheep out onto a wheat stubble field and have a benefit to the farmer by those lambs applying their manure and urine as fertilizer, we wanted to see what those differences were. So we actually did use a soil Penetrometer to look at compaction, and I brought it along with me just so you could see what it looks like. So this is a soil Penetrometer. I think we spent probably $300 on this. You can get them much cheaper. They make a pocket Penetrometer that's much smaller, or you can get them much, much more expensive if you want a high-tech model. But how to use this, it actually just measures the kilograms of force that it takes to push this into the ground. So you could use this on your own operation if you wanted. It's really simple to use. The only thing is you have to use it when your soil is at water capacity. It has to be completely saturated to use this. If I tried to use this on the hard ground right now, first of all, I wouldn't even be able to get it into the ground, and the measurements would not be accurate. But this was just a really quick and dirty way to go out there and take measurements in our fields at Fort Ellis. So we had the sheep that were out on the wheat stubble fields, and then we also had wheat stubble fields that were managed conventionally with minimum tillage and under an organic tillage situation. So out of all three treatments, we could compare the graze treatment to the tillage treatment to that conventional minimum tillage. And we did not see a difference between the conventional and the graze treatments. Tillage obviously did not have as much soil compaction, which we would expect. But it is good news to hear in the minimum tillage situation in the conventional, compared to a graze treatment where we have sheep out there for months at a time, we weren't seeing huge compaction differences. A big portion of this study, and Trestin is going to talk about this in hers too, but we want to look at the soil microbial communities. So between those two treatments, we want to see if putting livestock out on these fields is contributing to the microbial community, especially the diversity of the microbes. More diversity means you're doing more soil nutrient cycling and just a healthier soil. And so we took soil samples before and after putting sheep out on these fields. Right before putting them on their little feedlot setting, I'd go out and take soil samples all over all of the field, so conventional tillage as well as grazed. And then when the sheep finished grazing, I would do the same, go and take more soil samples so I could compare them. In the tilled plots and the grazed plots, we had actually more species that were related to the rhizosphere of the plants. And so that shows us that there's greater microbe richness in our tilled and grazed versus our conventionally managed plots. And that actually was a little surprising to me. I kind of thought, on our tillage plots, we were doing a lot of tillage, and that was our research. So we're going out every time we had a weed issue or we needed something done, we would go out and till, and that historically has been known to disrupt those soil microbial communities. But we actually saw that same diversity in the grazed and tilled, and it was the conventionally treated that showed a less richness in there. So that was really interesting. And Trestin's going to talk a little bit more about the microbe side of things. And we actually just got some results back from some produce farms on that. So it's been pretty interesting to see. And make sure I'm not missing anything else. Oh, there is a picture on the back of the handout and of the Warner-Bratzler shear force test. And this is always kind of interesting to me. So when we did the study, we harvested sheep from both treatments, all the treatments, so from either the confinement or the pasture in alfalfa versus barley, and we looked at tenderness and we looked at their carcass traits. And so for us to test the tenderness, we actually took a lamb chop from every lamb that we harvested, cooked them, so we have a special temperature monitoring device. We put a little probe in each lamb chop. It goes into the oven. We set a timer. We cook them for a specific amount of time. We flip the lamb chop over so everything is treated exactly the same. And then we have a little core tool that takes a core out of the lamb chop It goes into this little Werner Brasler shear force test that has a blade that as it pushes down, it measures the force to cut that little core of the lamb chop in half. So that's how, always kind of interesting how we get tenderness values. That's how we measure tenderness. One major part of this is adding the manure to the soil. When we think of a forage finished lamb versus a grain finished lamb, grain is highly digestible compared to forage, which is less digestible. So a lot more comes out of the back end of a forage fed lamb as manure going onto the soil. So alfalfa was a fairly expensive pellet to feed these lambs, but they applied almost 60% more manure to the soil than the barley fed lambs. And so if you're a farmer and you're trying to increase soil organic matter or nutrients in your soil, if you're feeding a forage and less is being digested and more is going out of the sheep onto the soil, that's something to consider. We did see a significant difference, almost a significant difference, I should say, 0.09 p-value, but for soil organic matter in the grazed alfalfa treatment was at 4.7% compared to 4.4 for the barley or 4.5 for the conventional treatment. And I know Mac did his spiel about organic matter, so I won't spend too much time on that. But
What is conventional?
So conventional was we used herbicide and minimum tillage to manage those plots. We took of the soil samples for the different treatments, we did not see a difference in nitrogen. We did see a difference in phosphorus, and that is commonly known that manure usually contains a lot of phosphorus. So there was a lot more phosphorus added to the soil in our graze treatments compared to the conventional or the tilled treatments. We saw no difference in quality grade between forage, barley, or in confinement versus field. So no difference in quality grade when we harvested those lambs. But I think what we've seen so far is that adding sheep to a cropping system can be really beneficial, and we're seeing greater microbe richness in the soil. At the same time, we're also seeing a big benefit to the sheep. And I know you can't measure this in science, but just watching the sheep out on the plots in the fields compared to in confinement, where they're just sitting around in confinement, the sheep that were out in the fields, they ran and played all day long. And I have a little note on here about ribeye area. So if we're looking at the size of the lamb chops, lambs that were out in the field had bigger ribeyes than lambs in confinement. And the only thing I can really think that would influence that is that they're just gaining more muscle out in the plots by running around and playing more. So you can't really measure happiness in sheep. You could definitely do more stress tests on sheep and look at cortisol levels, but the sheep that were out in the plots definitely seemed to have just a better life than the ones that were in confinement. I don't know how many times I had to pick up their mineral feeders because they spent so much time playing with them and jumping on them and tipping them over compared to the sheep that were in confinement that just kind of sat around bored all day.
Mm-hmm. You said that the sheep that were fed alfalfa pellets had more manure than barley.
Yes.
Where is that difference coming from? Does that manifest itself with smaller gains in alfalfa sheep? Are they eating more, or is it higher water content in the manure?
The sheep were definitely consuming more alfalfa, almost twice as much. And since barley is so digestible and it's a concentrated feed, they don't have to consume as much to get the nutrients. So alfalfa, I think, was at 60% digestibility, or I can't remember what the exact number was now, but they were consuming more, and so the cost of gain was much higher for the alfalfa-fed sheep. And I guess we did, and this was for research again, so we spent whatever it was to pay for these alfalfa pellets to be processed and made into the same formulation as these barley-fed pellets. in a practical sense, as a producer, if alfalfa was that much more than barley at the time, you'd probably be looking around for a different feed source. So cost of gain was much higher because they were eating so much more, almost double the amount that the barley-fed sheep were.
Gains different at all?
Gains between alfalfa and barley, I don't think were different. Let me see if I have it written on here. No, there's no difference between alfalfa and barley, just between the confinement and the field finished lambs.
You know I'm going to ask, but is there any economic analysis of the differences of these treatments in terms of any practical sense of it being more economical to graze them outside and versus confinement, or is that just not in what you were trying to discover?
In this study, we had a lot going on in this
Right.
study. We were also measuring parasite loads in sheep. We were measuring salt intake. We were doing the soil microbes. We were looking at forage quality. And so we did not have any econ side to it. There would be so much to look at, though, that it would be hard to do. I mean, if you're actually trying to compare a feedlot to a feedlot on fields, I mean, the amount of the labor differences, it would completely depend on how it was set up. So I guess the only thing I can say is just further research is needed.
Classic.
Yes. Sorry, I had to do it.